When we understand connective tissue, then we can understand lots of medical procedures, such as the way we can cool sculpt adipose, the fat cells of our body, and in doing so, reduce the thickness of our adipose layer, or fat. You can see it shrinking down. Be slick. Well, this is a big group, the connective tissues. We have, take a look at this lower diagram, you'll see what we're going to cover. Fibrous, so we think of tendons. Loose connective, this is sort of the glue that we find in lots of parts of the body, kind of making sure that tissues stay in place. Blood, that's a liquid form of connective tissue. Bone, I think most of us know bone, and I'll go through these. Cartilage, that rubbery substance we find at the end of joints. And adipose, what I just covered here. Extracellular, look at that word. Extra means kind of outside the cells. There's a mixture, and this ground substance is just like the name implies. It's kind of a background of water molecules, chondroitin sulfate, and these all provide support for the fibers. Okay, so the fibers can't just float in air; they have to be kind of anchored in this ground substance. The fibers that we can see under the microscope is collagen. These tend to be very thick and elastic. Find it in bone cartilage. Thank goodness, because if it wasn't there, our bones would shatter when we bump them. Elastic, these tend to be thinner. Let's see if we can find the elastic. Here they are. They look like tiny threads under the microscope, and you can see here the difference between elastic and collagen. It allows our skin to stretch without tearing, and we find it in many places: skin, blood vessels, where we have stretchability. Finally, reticular, these form a network, and these aren't so easy to see under the microscope. Here they are in this diagram here. And they form a framework so that soft organs don't just flop around. Loose connective, let's see, a good example is, blood cells. Let's just go through these. I think it's best sometimes to see examples. Areolar is what we just looked at, and collagen, elastic, reticular fibers, deep to the skin, so that means it's not at the surface, and it supports really nearly every structure in the body. Marfan syndrome is inherited, and if we have a defective gene, then our elastic fibers are weak, and you can see in this gentleman here some of the consequences. We need this fibrous material to be stout and serve us for the rest of our lives. Adipocytes, this was kind of at the introduction. I mentioned adipose. It's where we store triglycerides. As we gain more weight, these adipocytes are going to swell. So take a look at the diagram here. This is probably taken through a buttocks or a fatty part. And as we gain weight, it's going to push the living parts of the cell, the cytoplasm here. And so pretty soon, just look like spider webs. And these are the living parts, and the white areas here are just packed with adipose. One of the problems is as we gain weight, our blood vessels have to keep these cells alive, and that's going to contribute to heart disease. We have white adipose, which is, well, it's the most common form for adults, and it does have some benefits. Okay, it's going to provide insulation from heat loss, so that in cold environments, we stay nice and cozy. Liposuction is a surgical procedure where we suction, and you can see an example here, and a little bit of body contouring, but there are some problems with this: infection, and sometimes fat enters blood vessels, and then we get sometimes an embolus and even stroke or some form of heart disease. Not very common. Cryolipolysis is what our introductory video was about, how we can use cold to kill adipocytes, but the surrounding tissue is not affected. So this is a pretty slick new technique. Dense. So this is not loose, it's dense, and the collagen fibers are in regular bundles without these fibroblasts in between. Collagen's a protein, so it heals slowly because it doesn't have its own blood vessels. And that is why when we injure a joint, shoulder, a knee, hip. It takes a long time to heal. The other going to attend tendons attach muscles to bone and ligaments bone to bone. And we'll get to this in later lectures. The collagen fiber is woven, and we see these sheets in the body. Here's a good example down below. Fascia. I think the iliotibial band, where a lot of people, as they age, this tissue is going to dry out a bit, and they try to roll it with a foam roller, and they massage it, do what they can, but it's still sometimes painful. ITB, iliotibial band syndrome. Elastic fibers are very abundant in the trachea, the arteries, vocal cords, wherever we need the tissue to stretch. Cartilage is very interesting because it has collagen and elastic fibers and a very dense gel of chondroitin sulfate. Now, you could buy this stuff at health food stores. There's some evidence it works to reduce the loss of cartilage, a disease called arthritis. Resilience is a term that refers to the ability of a tissue to resume its former shape. And cartilage has both tensile strength, and so it can be stretched without torn, and it has compressional strength. It can be crushed. And it's a wonderful tissue, and thank goodness we find it in many areas, especially on the ends of our joints. It does lack blood vessels, which I mentioned, so it's slow to heal. And there are anti-angiogenesis factors. So look at that word for a minute. Anti means kind of against. Angio, we think of heart or blood vessels. Genesis, think of the Bible, the beginnings. So this prevents blood vessels from beginning or being formed. And we use it for cancer treatment because sometimes we can starve a tumor by using anti-angiogenesis factors. Chondrocytes, these are the cartilage cells, and here's a good example of what they look like under the microscope. You have this ground substance or a matrix, the lacuna here, and the chondrocyte is inside the lacuna. So lacuna is kind of like a cave. Pericardium is where the nerves and blood vessels help to form new cartilage. And later I'll get into this in greater detail. This is just a summary. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. It has this gel that provides a lot of flexibility. We find it on the ends of bones, the trachea, of course the nose, ears, ribs. Even though it's abundant, it's still relatively weak. Osteoarthritis, I mentioned earlier, gradual loss of hyaline cartilage in joints. And so as the joints, here's an example here, as the joints lose their cartilage layer, then inflammation and our own tissues start to dissolve the bone. My research, this is my son Aaron here, is we climb into trees and we study the movements of monkeys. Okay, when a monkey moves a lot, it doesn't develop cartilage because remember, cartilage has no blood supply. So how does it feed? As we move, it's crushed and it springs back like a sponge. And so the monkeys in zoos, they get arthritis pretty quickly because they don't move enough. And that's a good lesson for all of us. We need to keep moving until we die. Fiber cartilage is the strongest, combining strength and rigidity. And it's often in these capsular structures of the joints and in the intervertebral discs right here. These are the little pads between our bony vertebra. Meniscus. That's an incredible structure, this horseshoe-shaped articular cartilage. Elastic cartilage is elastic and it maintains some of the shape, such as the outer ear, top of the larynx. Bone, here's a big story, but let's keep it simple because this is a summary. Rings of tissue. This whole structure is called an osteon, so it's like a unit. Lamellae are the rings of calcium, so you see these alternating rings. There's a reason I chose this picture. Those are lamellae. Lacunae are the spaces. So these little look like eyes almost. And inside are the osteocytes. Now these guys are going to die because they're surrounded in bone unless they get nourishment. And that's what these canaliculi are. Under the microscope, they're so fine. They're very difficult to see. You have to believe they're there. The central canal is in the middle, and it's going to have blood vessels and nerves. Look at this cool tissue engineering. So we're using synthetic material, and that's a big area of science right now, bioengineering. And so we can insert this little stent-like device and provide the scaffolding so that the body, well, here's the beginnings here to the left, and the body is going to deposit bone and incorporate that little scaffolding structure, so that because you understand the bone needs something to deposit on, and so we provide it there. Spongy bone, it lacks organized osteons, so we find this mostly in the middle of long bones. You can see here. Liquid connective tissue, it seems strange because it's not really connective, but it's in this group. Has plasma, which is the liquid part, cells. And then we have lymphatic fluids, which are extracellular. They're outside cells. It flows through lymphatic vessels. You know, we hear a lot about blood vessels here. Here's a good example. You know, arteries and veins. But a lot of people don't know there's this parallel network of lymph vessels that help us to fight diseases. Different types of membranes. We have epithelial, which is a mucous membrane, or serous membrane, or cutaneous. It kind of depends on where they are. Mucus is going to be one of those barriers to infection. Some people think mucus is bad, but I don't know. You might live 3 or 4 weeks before you die if you didn't have mucus. Serous, or I don't have a good example here, but well, we could say the lungs here. There's sheets of areolar tissue with fluid in between them, so that we can take a deep breath and these organs can expand, and they just slide past these slick and serous membranes. Cutaneous, or at the surface of the epidermis and dermis, so yeah, all surface tissue. Synovial, these membranes, let's look at the far right, they're going to secrete a synovial fluid that nourishes, and this is how cartilage feeds. Okay, here's that cartilage on the end of the bone, and synovium contains all the oxygen and the nutrients that these guys need. So they can live without blood vessels, which is kind of unusual. Muscle composed of these long myocytes. See that prefix myo? Think of muscles. Helps us to maintain posture, generate heat. We have skeletal muscles, which are under voluntary control, so we can flex these. And these are what we often think of as muscles. Cardiac muscle, which is involuntary. We can't tell our heart, well, we can to some extent, but we can't control a precise beatings of our heart. And finally, smooth is in many organs that it's involuntary. We don't tell the stomach when to contract. You know, it knows to do this on its own. So it aids in this movement of substances through the lungs, intestines, bladder, and even eye movements to some extent are influenced by this. Finally, we get to nervous tissue. Here's the neuron. And dendrites are these branch-like structures here. And they're going to receive the signal in the postsynaptic cleft and then down to the cell body, which is kind of the cytoplasm and the life center of this is. Then the axon, which is sometimes insulated with a myelin sheath. And surrounding these guys are the neuroglia, which we don't hear about much, but they're so important. They're going to keep this area safe, protected, and they're going to nourish the neurons. Aging. You know, even Hollywood movie stars seem to have a problem. They can't seem to stop their bodies from aging. And part of that's because glucose, which is a sugar, is just bonding randomly to proteins throughout the body. And this happens over time. We get these cross-links between proteins, and eventually the collagen, which we think of in skin, elastin, and other fibers, they're just going to become stiff. And that's going to influence movements, blood flow, and you know, it's just a cascade of effects. And one day we wake up and we're old. And then one day the game is over.